A pregnant woman goes into labor alone, while the man who should be by her side chooses comfort and secrecy with his mistress, believing power and money can bury everything. He has no idea he has crossed the final line, because this is not just a medical emergency. It is the moment the father arrives, rage explodes, and a punch straight to his face sets off consequences that cannot be undone. What follows is a collision of abandonment, accountability, and justice that unfolds step by step, from the hospital to the courtroom. Stay with us until the end, and tell us what time it is and where you are watching from by dropping a comment below. Lena Whitmore felt the first contraction strike without warning. It came like a sudden tightening deep inside her body, sharp enough to steal her breath and force her hand to press instinctively against her swollen stomach. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to convince herself it was nothing more than discomfort, but the pain did not fade. It returned again, stronger, closer, relentless. She was not mistaken. Labor had begun. Marcus Whitmore was not with her. He was across the city, seated beside Clara Hayes, his phone resting face down on the table between them. The space around him was warm and controlled, filled with quiet conversation and dim lighting. Clara leaned toward him, relaxed, confident, her posture casual, as if nothing urgent could possibly exist beyond that room. Lena tried to steady herself, but another contraction surged through her body. Her knees weakened. She reached for the wall, her fingers trembling as she struggled to remain upright. The pain arrived in waves now, each one closer than the last, each one more demanding. Her breathing became uneven. Panic crept in as she realized she could no longer manage this alone. She reached for her phone. Her hands shook as she scrolled to Marcus's name and pressed call. The ringing echoed in her ears, loud and unbearable. She counted each second, hoping he would answer, hoping he would hear the strain in her voice and understand what was happening. The call went unanswered. She tried again and again. On the fourth attempt, the call was rejected. Lena stared at the screen, disbelief giving way to fear. She sent a message instead, short and urgent, telling him she was in pain, telling him the baby was coming, telling him she needed him now. The message showed as delivered. There was no reply. Clara Hayes noticed Marcus glance briefly at his phone. She did not ask what the call was about. She already knew. She had seen the name flash across the screen. She watched his expression remain unchanged as he placed the phone back on the table. She said nothing. Another contraction bent Lena forward. A sharp cry escaped her before she could stop it. Her legs buckled, and she slid down until her back met the cold floor. She clutched her stomach, her body shaking as she tried to breathe through the pain. The world around her blurred, narrowing to the rhythm of agony and the growing fear that something was wrong. Marcus remained where he was. He chose not to leave. He chose not to ask questions. He chose not to stand up and go to his wife. Instead, he stayed beside Clara Hayes. Time passed in fragments for Lena. She was dimly aware of voices nearby, of someone kneeling beside her, of hands hovering uncertainly as strangers tried to understand what was happening. She could not explain clearly. She could barely speak. Her breaths came in short gasps, each one punctuated by pain that felt deeper and more dangerous than anything she had experienced before. Someone noticed the blood on her dress. Someone noticed how pale she was. A call was made, not by her husband. An ambulance arrived with flashing lights that cut through the evening. Paramedics moved quickly, their voices firm and controlled as they assessed her condition. They asked her questions she struggled to answer. They checked her vitals, exchanged glances, and made decisions without delay. Lena was lifted onto a stretcher as another contraction tore through her body. She cried out, her fingers gripping the side rail as the doors closed and the siren began to wail. The sound followed her into the night, carrying her away from the place where she had been left behind. She was rushed into the emergency department and taken straight to obstetrics. Nurses surrounded her immediately, guiding her into a hospital bed as monitors were attached and readings began to appear on the screens around her. Her breathing was shallow. Her pulse was rapid. The pain did not slow. The fetal monitor told a story the staff did not like. The baby's heart rate fluctuated, dipping and rising unpredictably. The room grew tense as adjustments were made and additional staff were called in. The atmosphere shifted from urgency to alarm. Questions were asked. Where was her husband? Who could authorize decisions if complications arose? Why had she arrived alone? There was no answer to any of them. Marcus Whitmore did not appear. Minutes turned into an hour. Lena drifted in and out of awareness, her body exhausted, her mind clouded by pain and fear. She asked for Marcus more than once, her voice barely audible. Each time, the response was silence or gentle reassurance that someone was trying to reach him. No one could. Across the city, Clara Hayes learned that Lena had been taken to the hospital. The information came quietly, almost casually. Her lips curved into a small smile that she did not attempt to hide. She leaned back in her chair, satisfied, secure in the knowledge that the woman she saw as an obstacle was now out of the room and out of the way. Marcus remained absent. Back in the hospital, staff began documenting the circumstances of Lena's arrival in detail: the time, the condition, the absence of any family member, the lack of response from her spouse. Notes were added. Questions were raised. The term abandonment was not spoken aloud yet, but it was already taking shape in the records. This was not a routine delivery. This was not an accident. This was a serious medical situation made worse by deliberate absence. No one in the room could explain why a husband would vanish at a moment like this. There was confusion, disbelief, and quiet anger among those caring for her. They had seen neglect before, but rarely so clear, so complete. Lena lay on the hospital bed, her hands resting protectively over her stomach, her face pale and drawn. Machines beeped steadily beside her, each sound marking the fragile balance between danger and survival. Outside the room, questions began to form. Inside, one remained unanswered. Would Lena and her baby make it through the night? Lena Whitmore was rushed through the hospital doors without pause. The stretcher wheels rattled across the floor as the emergency team moved with urgency, calling out vital signs and instructions. She was taken straight into the obstetrics emergency unit, bypassing every waiting area, every formality. Her condition left no room for delay. The contractions did not follow a normal rhythm. They came too fast, too strong, and without recovery in between. Lena cried out as her body tightened again, the pain cutting deep and stealing what little strength she had left. Her hands gripped the sides of the bed as nurses worked around her, attaching monitors, adjusting equipment, and preparing for the worst. Dr. Ethan Brooks entered the room moments later. He took control immediately, his voice calm but firm as he reviewed the incoming information. One look at Lena told him this was not a routine labor. Her skin was pale, her breathing uneven, and her body was under extreme stress. He moved to her side and began issuing clear instructions to the staff, directing them with precision born of experience. The fetal monitor lit up beside the bed. The baby's heart rate fluctuated sharply on the screen, rising and dropping in irregular patterns that drew instant concern. Doctor, Brooks studied the numbers closely, his expression tightening as he watched the line fail to settle into a stable rhythm. This was a warning sign, one that could not be ignored. Lena drifted in and out of consciousness as the pain overwhelmed her. Between contractions, she whispered the same question again and again. She asked where her husband was. She asked if Marcus had arrived. Her voice was weak, barely audible, but the desperation behind it was unmistakable. There was no answer. No signature had been provided. No consent forms had been signed. More importantly, there was no sign of Marcus Whitmore anywhere in the hospital. His absence was noted, then noted again, until it became impossible to overlook. A nurse documented the situation carefully, recording the lack of spousal presence and the repeated failed attempts to contact him. Another staff member checked the phone numbers listed in the system, dialing and redialing with no success. Each unanswered call added weight to the situation. The conclusion was unavoidable. This was a case of abandonment. Dr. Brooks did not waste time assigning blame. His priority was the safety of the patient and her unborn child. He ordered the activation of the highest emergency response protocol, bringing additional specialists into the room and preparing for potential complications. Every minute mattered now. Lena's strength continued to fade. Her body trembled with exhaustion as the contractions showed no mercy. Tears slipped down her temples as she fought to stay conscious, her hands instinctively resting over her stomach in a protective gesture. The emotional toll was as heavy as the physical one. She was frightened, alone, and overwhelmed. The medical team moved quickly but carefully, balancing urgency with precision. Medications were adjusted, monitors were recalibrated. Dr. Brooks spoke in short, direct phrases, ensuring that every member of the team understood their role. Meanwhile, the medical record grew longer by the minute. Each fluctuation in heart rate, each spike in pain, each unanswered call was logged in detail. Timestamps marked the progression of events, creating a clear and undeniable timeline. This was no longer just a medical emergency. It was a documented crisis. Dr. Brooks addressed the staff with clarity. He confirmed that if intervention was delayed any further, both mother and baby faced serious risk. Complications could escalate quickly, and outcomes could change within moments. The room absorbed the gravity of his words. Hospital staff attempted once more to reach family members. The contact list was reviewed carefully, searching for anyone who could be reached. Names were scanned, numbers were checked. Then, one entry stood out. Robert Whitmore. The name was listed as the emergency contact. A nurse confirmed the information and immediately initiated the call. The phone rang as Lena moaned softly on the bed, her eyes fluttering open and shut. The sound of the ringing felt heavy in the room, carrying with it the weight of hope and fear. The call connected. On the other end of the line, Robert Whitmore listened as the situation was explained. He heard the words clearly, each one striking with increasing force. His daughter was in labor. The situation was dangerous. The baby's condition was unstable. Her husband was nowhere to be found. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Robert responded. His voice was steady, but something beneath it shifted. He asked precise questions, absorbing every detail without interruption. He did not raise his voice. He did not hesitate. He acknowledged the severity of the situation and assured the hospital that he was on his way. The call ended, and the nurse documented the time. Back in the room, Lena let out a faint cry as another contraction surged through her body. Dr. Brooks leaned closer, speaking to her in a reassuring tone, encouraging her to breathe and stay focused. He did not promise anything he could not guarantee. He spoke only in facts and calm direction. The monitors continued their relentless beeping. Every sound in the room carried significance. Every movement was purposeful. The staff worked as a coordinated unit, fully aware that the margin for error was slim. Lena was not just a patient. She was a woman fighting for her life and the life of her child. Outside the room, the atmosphere remained tense. The absence of Marcus Whitmore was no longer just notable, it was damning. Questions circulated quietly among staff members, not spoken aloud, but clearly understood. Why was he not here? Why had he not answered? Why had this woman been left alone at such a critical moment? Inside the room, none of those questions mattered yet. What mattered was survival. Lena squeezed her eyes shut as another wave of pain passed through her. Her breathing slowed slightly under guidance, but her body remained under immense strain. She whispered Marcus's name once more, the sound barely forming before fading into exhaustion. There was still no answer. What remained was the reality of the moment. A mother in danger, a child at risk, a medical team racing against time, and, somewhere far away, a father who had just learned that everything could be lost if he did not act immediately. The moment between life and death had arrived. Robert Whitmore left the emergency board meeting without hesitation the moment his phone vibrated in his hand. The room had been filled with measured voices and projected figures, but none of it mattered anymore. He listened to the words coming through the line, each one clear and controlled, yet heavy with urgency. By the time the call ended, his decision had already been made. He gathered his coat, informed no one of where he was going, and stepped out. He did not delay. Traffic blurred past as his driver pushed forward through the city streets. Robert sat upright in the back seat, his expression unreadable, his mind focused on a single destination. Every second carried weight. He replayed the information he had been given, the condition of his daughter, the instability, the absence that had been mentioned without commentary, but with unmistakable meaning. He did not allow himself to speculate yet. He needed to see her. The hospital entrance was brightly lit, but the space beyond felt subdued. Robert moved through the doors with controlled urgency, his footsteps steady against the polished floor. The usual noise of a hospital seemed muted as he passed the reception desk and followed the directions he had been given. Staff members noticed him, some recognizing his face, others sensing his authority without knowing why. No one stopped him. The corridor outside the obstetrics emergency unit was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that followed urgency, when action had already been taken and outcomes were still uncertain. Robert slowed slightly as he approached the doorway, his attention sharpening. He took in the smell of antiseptic, the low hum of machines, the distant sound of hurried voices behind closed doors. Then he saw her. Lena Whitmore lay on the emergency bed, her body tense beneath the thin hospital sheet. Her face was pale, drawn with pain, her hair damp and pushed back from her forehead. Tubes and wires surrounded her, connecting her to machines that monitored what her body struggled to manage on its own. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, and labored. For a brief moment, Robert did not move. The sight of his daughter in that condition struck him with a force he had not expected. This was not the composed woman he knew, not the daughter who had faced life with quiet strength. This was someone in danger, someone suffering, someone exposed. His chest tightened, and he forced himself to breathe. The steady beeping of the fetal monitor filled the room. It was rhythmic, persistent, but tense. The sound did not bring comfort. It demanded attention. Robert's eyes shifted to the screen, where the lines rose and fell with unsettling inconsistency. He understood enough to know that stability was not guaranteed. Dr. Ethan Brooks stepped forward. He introduced himself and began to explain the situation with clinical precision. He described the irregular labor pattern, the stress Lena's body was under, and the concern for the baby's condition. His tone was calm, but the content left no room for false reassurance. This was a serious case, one that required immediate and sustained attention. Robert listened without interruption. When Dr. Brooks finished, Robert asked a single question. "Where was Marcus Whitmore?" The doctor paused briefly before answering. He explained that Marcus had not arrived. There had been no response to repeated attempts to contact him. No authorization had been provided, no presence recorded. The absence had been noted from the beginning. The words settled heavily in the room. Robert looked back at his daughter. He saw the way her hand rested protectively over her stomach, even in exhaustion. He saw the tension in her jaw as another contraction passed through her. He understood, without needing further explanation, what this absence meant. He asked again, this time directing the question to the room. Had anyone been able to reach Marcus Whitmore? The answer was the same. No one could. The realization took shape slowly but decisively. This was not a delay. This was not circumstance. This was abandonment. Robert felt a shift inside himself, something tightening and rising at the same time. His expression remained controlled, but the change was visible in his eyes. The calm authority he carried did not disappear. It sharpened. He nodded once, acknowledging what he had learned. Then he spoke. He stated clearly that he wanted to see Marcus Whitmore immediately. His voice was steady, measured, and firm. It was not a request born of emotion. It was a directive. The hospital staff exchanged cautious glances. They were accustomed to urgency, but there was something different in Robert's presence now, a gravity that extended beyond the walls of the room. No one argued. No one challenged him. They explained that Marcus was not currently in the building. They did not know when or if he would arrive. Robert absorbed this information without outward reaction. His gaze returned to Lena, lingering on her face. He allowed himself one more moment there, standing beside her bed, his hand resting lightly on the rail. He did not speak to her yet. He did not want to add to her strain. Instead, he focused inward. He recognized the anger building beneath his composure. It was not sudden or explosive. It was controlled, layered, and dangerous. The kind of anger that came from understanding exactly what had gone wrong and who was responsible. He straightened and turned back to the staff. Robert thanked Dr. Brooks for the explanation and for the care being provided. His tone remained professional, but there was an unmistakable edge now. He instructed them to continue doing everything necessary to protect both mother and child. There was no ambiguity in his expectation. Dr. Brooks confirmed that they would. As Robert prepared to leave the room, he paused. He looked once more at the monitors, at the lines that represented the fragile balance his daughter was fighting to maintain. He memorized the image. He wanted it clear in his mind. Then he stepped away. The staff parted quietly as he exited the emergency unit. The corridor outside seemed even more silent than before. Robert moved down it with purpose, his pace controlled but deliberate. His mind was no longer occupied with questions. He knew what had happened. He knew what it meant. And he knew what had to come next. Robert Whitmore left the emergency room to confront the truth. Marcus Whitmore arrived at the hospital far later than anyone expected him to. He walked through the entrance with an air of annoyance that stood in sharp contrast to the urgency of the place. His steps were quick but careless, his shoulders tense, his face set in irritation rather than concern. He adjusted his jacket as he moved, as though the building itself were an inconvenience interrupting his night. When he reached the corridor outside the obstetrics unit, he saw Robert Whitmore standing there. Marcus stopped. The sight of Robert immediately unsettled him. His jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed, irritation flashing across his face. He did not greet him. He did not ask about Lena. Instead, he exhaled sharply, as if Robert's presence alone was an accusation he did not want to face. Marcus spoke first. His voice carried impatience and defensiveness. He complained about being summoned so urgently, about the disruption to his schedule. He mentioned obligations and misunderstandings, framing the situation as something blown out of proportion. His words came fast, practiced, stripped of emotion. They sounded more like excuses than explanations. Robert listened in silence. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He did not react outwardly. His posture remained calm and controlled, his eyes fixed steadily on Marcus. The silence he offered was deliberate, allowing Marcus to continue speaking without resistance. Marcus mistook the silence for weakness. He continued talking, growing bolder with each sentence. He spoke as if this were a business delay rather than a medical emergency. He justified his absence with detached logic, as though the danger unfolding nearby were an abstract problem rather than a lived reality. Robert still did not respond. Then Marcus mentioned Lena. His tone was cold, dismissive. He referred to her condition as inconvenient, something unfortunate, but poorly timed. He did not ask how she was. He did not express concern. He spoke of her as a complication that had interfered with his plans, rather than a woman in labor facing real danger. The atmosphere shifted. Robert's gaze hardened, but he remained silent. He allowed Marcus to continue. Knowing exactly where this was heading, Marcus added one final sentence. It was the sentence that crossed the line. It stripped the situation of any remaining humanity. It reduced Lena's pain, the risk to the baby, and the gravity of the moment into an inconvenience he believed he could address later. That sentence shattered Robert's restraint. The control he had maintained since arriving at the hospital fractured instantly. His breathing slowed, deliberate and heavy. His hands clenched at his sides. The anger that rose within him was not reckless. It was focused, precise, and overwhelming. Robert stepped forward. The movement was sudden but measured. He closed the distance between them until they stood face to face. Marcus barely had time to register what was happening. There was no shouting, no warning, no dramatic buildup. The punch came without hesitation. Robert's fist struck Marcus squarely in the face. The impact was sharp and unmistakable. Marcus staggered backward, completely unprepared. His balance failed him for a moment as shock registered before pain. His body recoiled, and he stumbled, barely managing to stay upright. The sound echoed through the corridor. Hospital staff reacted instantly. Security moved in without delay. stepping between the two men. Voices rose in alarm as hands reached out to prevent any further escalation. The calm efficiency of the hospital tightened around the disruption, restoring order with practiced speed. Robert stopped immediately. He did not attempt a second strike. He did not resist security. His breathing remained controlled, his posture firm. The violence ended the moment it began. Marcus straightened slowly, stunned. His composure had cracked. He touched his face, disbelief written clearly across his expression. The confidence he carried into the hospital had vanished, replaced by shock and humiliation. Security maintained separation as the corridor fell into tense silence. Nurses and staff watched from a distance, fully aware they had witnessed something irreversible. This was not a private confrontation. It had happened in full view. Robert stood still. He did not apologize. He did not explain himself. He did not justify the action. His silence carried weight, heavier than any argument. The punch had not been reckless. It had been a boundary drawn in a single, undeniable moment. This was not an outburst. It was a declaration. Marcus understood that now. Whatever protection he believed his wealth provided had failed him. He had been confronted publicly, decisively, and without hesitation. The authority he relied on had meant nothing in that moment. Robert turned away. He adjusted his jacket and took a steady breath. His expression returned to controlled calm, though his eyes remained dark with resolve. He did not look back at Marcus as he stepped past security and began walking down the corridor. The confrontation was over. Behind him, Marcus remained standing, shaken and silent, surrounded by the consequences of his own words and choices. The corridor felt different now, charged with the awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Those who witnessed the scene understood it immediately. This had not been the end of the conflict. It had been the ignition point. A single act that marked the moment where consequences began to move, unstoppable and irreversible. Robert Whitmore walked away with certainty. This was only the beginning. The atmosphere inside the hospital shifted almost immediately after the confrontation in the corridor. What had begun as a moment of shock quickly turned into something far more structured. Senior administrators arrived without delay, their movements calm but urgent, their expressions serious. They did not ask questions aloud. They already understood that something significant had occurred. Members of the hospital board stepped forward, positioning themselves with clear intent. When they addressed Robert Whitmore, they did so formally, using titles that carried weight and authority. Their tone was respectful, measured, and unmistakably deferential. The change was subtle, but impossible to miss. Marcus Whitmore noticed it instantly. The way people spoke to Robert was not the way one addressed a grieving parent alone. It was the way one addressed power. Marcus stood still, his earlier shock deepening into disbelief as the meaning of the words reached him. His expression shifted from irritation to confusion, then to something closer to alarm. Robert Whitmore was not simply a concerned father. He was the chief executive officer of a major medical and healthcare group. He was also a senior advisor to the hospital itself, someone whose influence extended beyond emotion and into governance. The realization struck Marcus with force. The ground beneath his assumptions began to collapse. Robert acknowledged the administrators with a brief nod. He did not raise his voice. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. His presence alone was confirmation enough. With quiet authority, Robert exercised his right to access internal procedures and records. No objections were raised. No delays were suggested. The administrators moved quickly to comply, opening channels that were normally restricted. The shift from personal conflict to institutional process happened in real time. Dr. Ethan Brooks was asked to provide a full account. He stepped forward without hesitation. His report was precise and chronological, detailing the moment Lena arrived, her condition upon admission, the irregular progression of labor, and the instability observed on the fetal monitor. He described the repeated attempts to contact Marcus, the absence of authorization, and the medical decisions made in response to that absence. His words were factual and restrained. They did not exaggerate. They did not soften the reality either. The medical records supported every statement. The documentation showed clearly defined timestamps, recorded observations, and formal notes, identifying the case as one of spousal abandonment. The evidence was unambiguous. The absence of Marcus Whitmore was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was recorded fact. Robert reviewed the information carefully. He did not interrupt Dr. Brooks. He did not challenge any detail. When the explanation concluded, Robert gave a single instruction. All records were to be preserved exactly as they were. No alterations, no summaries, no omissions. Every piece of evidence was to be secured. The administrators responded immediately. No one questioned the directive. No one suggested alternatives. The authority behind the order was absolute. Systems were locked, access logs were preserved, and protocols were followed without delay. The hospital moved from crisis response into evidence preservation with professional precision. Marcus watched this unfold in silence. For the first time since arriving, he began to understand the scope of what he was facing. This was no longer a private dispute. It was no longer a matter of explanation or justification. It had become procedural, documented, and irreversible. The risk was no longer hypothetical. It was real. Clara Hayes appeared at the edge of the group, her earlier confidence faltering. She attempted to step forward, but security quietly blocked her path. The gesture was small, but the message was unmistakable. She was no longer in control of the situation. Her posture changed. The smug assurance that had defined her presence earlier wavered. She glanced between Marcus and Robert, her expression tightening as she realized how quickly the balance of power had shifted. The attention she once enjoyed was gone, replaced by scrutiny and restraint. Robert did not acknowledge her directly. He did not need to. His focus remained on process. He issued instructions with minimal words, each one clear and specific. The tone was not emotional, it was operational. The conflict had moved beyond personal reaction and into institutional response. Emotion gave way to system. The hospital staff followed each instruction precisely. Files were secured, access was restricted, statements were logged. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a personal emergency had now entered a formal framework governed by rules and accountability. Marcus felt the pressure closing in. He had not been accused yet. No charges had been mentioned. But the structure forming around him left little doubt about what was coming. The absence that once seemed insignificant now stood at the center of a growing record. Robert said very little. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He did not explain himself to Marcus. His silence was intentional, allowing the process to speak for him. Every action taken reinforced the same message. This would not be handled privately. This would not be resolved quietly. The system was now engaged. Clara Hayes withdrew further, her earlier arrogance dissolving into uncertainty. She remained present but diminished, aware that her role was being reassessed with every passing minute. The protection she assumed Marcus could provide no longer felt secure. The administrators concluded their initial actions and confirmed that all necessary measures had been implemented. The hospital had done its part. The record was intact. The process had begun. Robert acknowledged them with a brief nod. The confrontation, the punch, the emotional explosion had all served their purpose. They had marked the moment when denial ended. Now came structure. Now came consequence. Marcus stood alone with that realization. Nothing further needed to be said. The counterattack was no longer emotional. It was official. Dr. Ethan Brooks completed the medical report in a controlled and deliberate manner. He understood the importance of every word he recorded. This document would not exist only within the hospital system. It would stand as an official account of what had happened to Lena Whitmore and how close the situation had come to irreversible harm. For that reason, he reviewed every detail with precision before finalizing the report. The report confirmed the seriousness of Lena's condition beyond any doubt. Her labor had progressed irregularly from the moment she arrived. The intensity and frequency of her contractions placed extreme strain on her body. Combined with severe physical exhaustion, this created a dangerous environment for both mother and child. The instability in the fetal heart rate was medically significant and consistent with prolonged stress. These findings left no room for interpretation or minimization. The documentation clearly identified the most critical factor in the case: time. Dr. Brooks recorded the exact period during which Lena had been without assistance before reaching medical care. The absence of her husband during that period was documented factually and chronologically. Every attempt to contact Marcus Whitmore was listed with precise timestamps. Missed calls, unanswered messages, and lack of physical presence were all included. The duration of abandonment was now a verified part of the medical record. Once the medical report was completed and signed, the process shifted from clinical response to legal action. Sarah Chen was contacted immediately and arrived at the hospital with professional composure. She did not ask unnecessary questions upon arrival. She requested access to all medical documentation related to Lena's case and began reviewing it in silence. Her approach was methodical and focused. She understood that accuracy at this stage would determine everything that followed. All medical evidence was formally transferred to her review. Sarah examined the physician reports, nursing logs, fetal monitoring data, and administrative notes. She confirmed that the documentation formed a continuous and unbroken record of events. There were no gaps in the timeline. There were no inconsistencies in the observations. The evidence clearly established medical risk and documented neglect. Based on this evidence, Sarah initiated preparation for an emergency protection order. The request was written carefully, relying solely on documented facts. It outlined Lena's medical vulnerability, the confirmed period of abandonment, and the necessity of immediate safeguards. The language was restrained and precise. The purpose of the order was not punitive. It was designed to prevent further harm and ensure uninterrupted medical care. As part of these emergency measures, Marcus Whitmore was formally prohibited from accessing Lena. The restriction was enforced through hospital protocol without confrontation. Security personnel were notified. Access permissions were updated in the system. Medical staff received clear instructions. Marcus was no longer permitted to approach the obstetrics unit or participate in any decisions regarding Lena's care. The hospital cooperated fully with the legal process. Administrators coordinated closely with legal counsel and medical leadership. Compliance was immediate and complete. There were no objections, no delays, and no attempts to soften the response. The institution recognized the gravity of the situation and acted accordingly. Clara Hayes was formally recorded in the related incident documentation. Her name appeared in the case file as an involved party. The inclusion was factual and neutral, but it placed her actions and communications within the official timeline. This ensured that her role would be subject to review as part of the overall investigation. All communication records connected to the case were secured. Phone logs were requested and preserved. Text messages and call attempts were documented with exact times. The digital evidence showed a clear pattern. Repeated attempts to reach Marcus during a medical emergency had failed. This evidence reinforced the conclusions already supported by medical records. Sarah Chen analyzed the material carefully. Her assessment focused on responsibility and legal exposure. She identified the elements that could support criminal liability, noting that deliberate inaction during a medical emergency carried serious consequences under the law. Her conclusions were measured and precise. They were based entirely on evidence rather than emotion. As these determinations were made, Marcus Whitmore's control over the situation continued to erode. Decisions were finalized without his involvement. Access remained restricted. Authority rested fully with medical and legal systems. The structure surrounding the case became increasingly firm and procedural, leaving no room for personal influence. Throughout this process, Robert Whitmore maintained complete silence. He did not speak to reporters. He did not issue statements. He did not respond to inquiries. His silence was strategic. It allowed the facts to speak for themselves and prevented the case from being shaped by speculation or emotion. Inside the hospital, Lena remained under constant observation. Her condition required close monitoring. Medical staff adjusted treatment as needed, responding to changes with vigilance. The focus remained on stabilization, minimizing risk, and protecting both mother and child through every stage of care. Around her, a comprehensive protection network was established. Security protocols were reinforced. Legal safeguards were activated. Medical oversight remained continuous. Each layer functioned in coordination, ensuring that Lena was no longer vulnerable to neglect or interference. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a personal emergency was now governed entirely by law and medicine. Emotion no longer dictated action. Documentation did, procedure did, accountability did. Marcus Whitmore was no longer facing a confrontation with individuals. He was facing a system. And that system was now fully engaged, methodical, and impossible to ignore. The information did not erupt all at once. It seeped outward, slowly at first, carried by whispered conversations and fragmented online posts. Early mentions were cautious, framed as questions rather than accusations. People asked why a pregnant woman had been rushed into emergency labor care without her husband present. The questions multiplied, and curiosity spread faster than restraint. Within a short span of time, the fragments connected. A wealthy man had not been there when his pregnant wife went into labor. Once that realization entered public discussion, containment became impossible. Online platforms amplified the narrative, and journalists began tracking the source of the information. Small digital outlets published brief notices citing hospital admissions and emergency procedures. Larger media organizations followed, assigning reporters to verify details and request official confirmation. The hospital became the focal point of inquiry. Administrators received a steady stream of calls and emails. Reporters asked whether a pregnant patient had arrived alone during a critical medical event. They asked how long she had been without assistance. They asked whether her husband had been contacted and whether he had responded. Each question narrowed public focus and intensified scrutiny. Sarah Chen moved quickly to establish control. She recognized that silence without structure would invite speculation, while uncontrolled disclosure could compromise legal stability. Her response was immediate and disciplined. All communication was centralized through her office. No medical staff member was permitted to speak independently. Every response would be factual, restrained, and verifiable. Only confirmed information was released. Statements acknowledged that Lena Whitmore had been admitted under emergency conditions and that her labor had required immediate intervention. Timelines were referenced precisely. No emotional language was introduced. No blame was assigned. The facts were allowed to stand without interpretation. This approach reshaped coverage. Media outlets anchored their reporting in documentation rather than conjecture. Analysts referenced hospital records to reconstruct events chronologically. Medical professionals were consulted to explain the risks associated with delayed care during labor. Each explanation reinforced the seriousness of the situation without exaggeration. Marcus Whitmore's public image deteriorated rapidly. Archived interviews and corporate profiles resurfaced across platforms. Promotional photographs from business events circulated alongside critical commentary. The contrast between his cultivated professional persona and the unfolding crisis sharpened public reaction. His name became inseparable from the story. Business consequences followed swiftly. Partners requested internal assessments of ongoing relationships. Meetings were postponed without explanation, then quietly canceled. Several organizations issued neutral statements, emphasizing concern and distance. Risk management teams flagged the situation as unstable. The reputational impact translated into measurable hesitation across financial and corporate sectors. Attention soon shifted toward Clara Hayes. Her association with Marcus placed her directly within the narrative. Online discussions scrutinized her recent public appearances and social activity. Commentary questioned her awareness of the medical emergency and her role during the critical period. The tone moved from curiosity to condemnation as timelines became clearer. Public sentiment aligned decisively. Support for Lena Whitmore surged across social platforms. Messages expressed outrage, sympathy, and moral condemnation. Advocacy groups referenced the case as an example of neglect during medical vulnerability. The story expanded beyond individuals and into broader conversations about power, responsibility, and accountability. Throughout this escalation, Robert Whitmore remained absent from public view. He did not appear before cameras. He did not issue statements. His silence was noted but not challenged. Observers understood that the response was being managed through legal channels rather than public emotion. His absence allowed focus to remain on documented facts. Medical records became the foundation of sustained coverage. Journalists cited precise timestamps recorded by hospital staff. Medical experts explained the potential consequences of delayed intervention during labor, including risks to both mother and child. Each explanation underscored vulnerability and urgency. The reliance on verified records strengthened credibility and maintained public attention. Marcus attempted to respond. Through intermediaries, he suggested miscommunication and misunderstanding. He implied exaggeration and confusion. These efforts failed immediately. Each claim was measured against documented timelines and medical reports. Public response was swift, dismissive, and unforgiving. His credibility eroded further with every statement. Professional standing declined rapidly. Invitations to speak were withdrawn. Planned announcements were delayed indefinitely. Financial analysts began discussing long-term damage to reputation and trust. The scandal extended beyond the immediate crisis and into every aspect of his public identity. Commentators began using a consistent phrase, a moral collapse. This framing resonated widely. The story was no longer about wealth or success. It was about a choice made during a critical moment and the consequences that followed. Analysts emphasized that the outcome did not result from complexity or confusion, but from absence. Pressure intensified day by day. Social discourse grew harsher. Industry leaders issued cautious remarks about values and accountability. Silence from Marcus was interpreted as avoidance. Any response risked contradiction. Any appearance risked further backlash. Sarah Chen continued monitoring the narrative closely. She intervened only when factual inaccuracies appeared. Her strategy did not change. Evidence guided public understanding. Documentation remained central. Emotional appeals were unnecessary when verified records spoke clearly. The atmosphere surrounding the case shifted completely. What began as a private medical emergency became a sustained public reckoning. Coverage no longer appeared sporadically. It became continuous and unrelenting. Each day brought renewed scrutiny and deeper consequence. The pressure did not ease. It escalated. And with every passing hour, Marcus Whitmore lost more control over a narrative, now driven entirely by verified facts, public judgment, and an irreversible collapse of trust that no statement could repair. Marcus Whitmore received the formal summons early in the morning, delivered directly to his residence. The document was concise and unambiguous. It stated clearly that he was required to cooperate with an official investigation concerning his conduct during a documented medical emergency involving his pregnant wife. There were no soft phrases, no room for interpretation, and no suggestion of negotiation. From the moment he read it, Marcus understood that this was no longer a matter of reputation management. The legal file was opened the same day. Investigators assembled a comprehensive case dossier that brought together every verified record connected to the incident. Medical charts from the hospital were placed alongside call logs, message records, security access data, and witness statements. Each item was catalogued and reviewed in sequence. What had once existed as scattered information was now consolidated into a single legal structure governed by formal procedure. The process moved quickly. Clara Hayes was summoned for questioning independently of Marcus. She was interviewed in a controlled environment, with no opportunity for coordination or external influence. Investigators focused on her knowledge of the medical emergency and her actions during the critical time period. At the beginning of the interview, she appeared composed and confident. She framed her involvement as minimal and emphasized uncertainty. As questioning continued, inconsistencies became apparent. Her timeline did not align with verified call records. Messages placed her closer to the unfolding situation than she initially admitted. When asked to clarify, her explanations shifted subtly, introducing new details that conflicted with earlier statements. Investigators documented each discrepancy carefully. The contradictions were not dramatic, but they were persistent, and over time they formed a pattern that weakened her credibility significantly. While Clara's interview raised concerns, the investigation expanded beyond personal testimony. Regulatory authorities initiated a full review of Marcus Whitmore's financial affairs. Bank accounts were examined for unusual activity. Investment portfolios were reviewed for timing that coincided with emerging risk. Corporate holdings were traced through layered ownership structures. The review was methodical and expansive, signaling that the inquiry would not remain limited to personal conduct alone. Inside Marcus's company, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. An emergency board meeting was convened with little notice. Directors gathered under legal advisement, fully aware that the situation posed immediate threats to governance and stability. Legal counsel outlined potential exposure, including reputational damage, regulatory scrutiny, and shareholder confidence. The discussion was sober and focused. No one questioned the seriousness of the moment. The decision was reached swiftly. Marcus Whitmore was suspended from all executive authority pending the outcome of the investigation. The action was framed as a necessary step to protect the company, but its implication was unmistakable. Control over daily operations was transferred immediately. Access to internal decision-making systems was revoked. The suspension marked a visible and irreversible fracture in leadership. The reaction from shareholders was immediate. Confidence eroded as information filtered through financial channels. Some investors reduced their positions quietly. Others requested formal clarification from the board. Market analysts flagged the company as unstable and advised caution. The response was measured but decisive. Trust, once damaged, did not wait for final conclusions. Clara Hayes felt the consequences as well. The informal protection she had relied upon disappeared. Legal boundaries tightened around her involvement. Communication channels narrowed. She was no longer shielded by association. Public attention, once focused primarily on Marcus, increasingly turned toward her role and her contradictory statements. Media coverage intensified. Journalists revisited earlier reports and connected them with newly confirmed information. Analysts examined behavioral patterns and decision-making under pressure. Each new development reinforced the same conclusion. This collapse was not sudden or accidental. It was the result of accumulated choices and omissions. Marcus began to recognize the depth of the situation. For the first time, denial no longer provided refuge. The investigation advanced without consultation. Financial reviews continued without his influence. Corporate systems functioned independently of his authority. The distance between his former control and his current position became impossible to ignore. His behavior reflected that loss of control. Those who interacted with him described agitation and lack of focus. Meetings ended abruptly. Conversations lacked direction. Attempts to reassert authority failed repeatedly. The mechanisms that once responded instantly to his directives now operated without reference to him. There was no dignified exit remaining. Every potential path narrowed as scrutiny expanded. Legal exposure deepened. Professional standing deteriorated further. The possibility of quiet withdrawal vanished. What remained was a slow, visible, unraveling, unfolding under constant observation. Throughout the process, Robert Whitmore remained absent. He did not attend hearings. He did not appear at corporate meetings. He did not address the media. His absence was deliberate and calculated. Those involved understood that his influence was operating through systems rather than spectacle. The collapse accelerated steadily. Legal proceedings advanced according to schedule. Corporate governance adjusted permanently to reflect new realities. Financial oversight intensified. Media attention remained relentless. Each element reinforced the others, creating momentum that could not be reversed. By the end of the week, the outcome was unmistakable. Marcus Whitmore was no longer a powerful executive facing temporary difficulty. He was a man confronting the consequences of documented actions and omissions. The structures that once protected him had dissolved completely. There was no path back, no negotiation, no restoration of control. The collapse was complete, and it was irreversible. The courtroom was filled long before the judge entered. Cameras were set in fixed positions. Reporters whispered quietly while observers settled into their seats. The case had drawn attention far beyond the city, not because of spectacle, but because it represented a clear question of responsibility. When the bailiff called the room to order, silence followed immediately. Sarah Chen stood when instructed. Her presentation was methodical and restrained. She began by outlining the sequence of events without embellishment. Each step was anchored in verified records. She presented medical documents first, establishing the reality of the emergency. The court was shown timelines that detailed Lena Whitmore's condition upon arrival at the hospital and the urgency required to stabilize her. Sarah then addressed communication records. Call logs and messages were introduced as evidence. The court reviewed timestamps showing repeated attempts to reach Marcus Whitmore during the critical period. Each attempt went unanswered. Sarah emphasized that these were not assumptions or interpretations. They were documented facts. The absence was measurable and undeniable. She concluded by clarifying the legal duty involved. A spouse had an obligation to respond during a medical emergency. Failure to do so, when documented and prolonged, constituted deliberate abandonment. Sarah did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to emotion. The evidence carried its own weight. Dr. Ethan Brooks was called to testify. He approached the stand calmly and answered questions with professional clarity. He explained Lena's medical condition upon admission and the risks associated with delayed care during labor. He confirmed that prolonged stress increased danger to both mother and fetus. His testimony was grounded in established medical standards. The court accepted his statements without challenge. Medical records were entered formally into evidence. The documentation confirmed that the emergency was real, immediate, and time-sensitive. The judge noted that the medical findings aligned with the timeline presented earlier. When Marcus Whitmore was given the opportunity to respond, the contrast was stark. His statements were brief and defensive. He did not deny the timeline. He did not dispute the medical emergency. Instead, he offered explanations that lacked supporting evidence. The court found these explanations insufficient. Denial without proof carried no weight against documented fact. The issue of abandonment was confirmed. The judge stated clearly that the evidence established a failure to act during a known medical emergency. This failure was not momentary. It occurred over a defined period, and despite repeated contact attempts, responsibility could not be deflected. Attention then shifted to Clara Hayes. Her involvement was addressed separately. The court reviewed her statements and compared them with verified records. Discrepancies were noted. While she did not hold legal authority over Marcus's actions, the court found that her behavior reinforced neglect rather than mitigated it. The judge described her role precisely. Clara Hayes was determined to be mentally complicit. Her actions and omissions contributed to the circumstances that allowed abandonment to continue. The court emphasized that complicity did not require direct action. Enabling neglect carried legal consequence. With responsibility established, sentencing began. The judge addressed Marcus Whitmore directly. He stated that wealth, influence, and status did not alter legal duty. The court considered the severity of the risk, the documented absence, and the impact on both mother and child. The sentence was delivered clearly. Marcus Whitmore was sentenced to 8 years in prison. The court specified that the sentence would be served as incarceration, without suspension or substitution. The judge further ordered a permanent prohibition on holding executive authority in regulated enterprises. A portion of Marcus's assets was ordered frozen to secure financial protection for Lena Whitmore and the child. The rationale was stated plainly. The sentence reflected accountability without excess. It acknowledged that Marcus did not physically inflict harm, but that deliberate abandonment during a medical emergency constituted serious violation of duty. The court then addressed Clara Hayes. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison for mental complicity in the abandonment. The court imposed additional restrictions to prevent contact with Lena Whitmore and the child following release. The judge emphasized that her actions, while secondary, carried real consequence. Custody and protection orders followed. The court ruled that all custodial rights would be granted exclusively to Lena Whitmore. Legal protections were established to ensure her safety and autonomy. The ruling emphasized stability and long-term security for both mother and child. At this moment, Robert Whitmore stood briefly. He did not speak. He did not challenge the ruling. His presence was limited to acknowledgement. He returned to his seat without expression. The gesture was restrained and final. There were no closing arguments. No apologies were requested. No justifications were offered. The courtroom remained focused on the judgment rather than reaction. The judge delivered the final declaration. The ruling was entered into record publicly. The court affirmed that abandonment during medical emergency violated both legal and moral duty. The judgment applied equally, regardless of wealth or position. Justice was declared established. Proceedings concluded without disturbance. Marcus Whitmore was taken into custody immediately. Clara Hayes was escorted separately. Observers remained silent as the courtroom emptied. Outside, there were no statements, no interviews, no explanations. The verdict spoke for itself. One chapter closed fully. The law had acted, and the consequences were final. The hospital room was quiet when Lena Whitmore finally went into active labor. The chaos that had once surrounded her life was no longer present. There were no raised voices, no uncertainty, and no fear of being abandoned. The medical team moved with calm precision, guiding her through each stage with practiced care. Lena focused on her breathing, aware of the weight of the journey that had led her here, but no longer defined by it. The birth was successful. Her child arrived safely, healthy and strong, crying with the unmistakable sound of life asserting itself. The moment the baby was placed in her arms, Lena felt a release she could not put into words. The pain, the fear, and the long months of uncertainty did not disappear entirely, but they lost their power. What remained was reality, tangible and alive. Doctors confirmed that the baby was in good condition. Vital signs were stable. There were no complications. The medical staff exchanged quiet nods of relief, knowing how close the situation had once come to a very different outcome. For Lena, the confirmation felt grounding. She was no longer waiting for the next crisis. She was present in the moment. Recovery did not happen instantly. In the days that followed, Lena moved slowly, both physically and emotionally. Her body healed in stages, responding to rest and care. Her mind required more time. The memories of abandonment, fear, and uncertainty surfaced unexpectedly, but they no longer controlled her. With each passing day, strength returned, not as sudden triumph, but as steady resilience. Robert Whitmore remained by her side. He did not offer speeches or reassurance filled with promises. He offered presence. He sat quietly when silence was needed. He listened when Lena spoke. He held his grandchild with a careful tenderness that reflected both pride and responsibility. For the first time in a long while, Lena felt supported without condition. There was no sign of Marcus. No messages arrived. No attempts were made to reach out. His absence was complete and final. The space he once occupied in Lena's life was empty, but it was no longer painful. It was simply gone. The absence created room for something else to exist. A new routine began to form. Lena learned the rhythms of caring for her child. Feeding, holding, and quiet moments replaced the constant vigilance she had lived under before. Each small task became an act of reclaiming control. She was no longer reacting to events imposed upon her. She was choosing how to move forward. Life outside the hospital continued. Legal processes reached their conclusion without requiring Lena's presence. Sarah Chen ensured that every remaining document was finalized, every order executed, and every protection enforced. Lena did not need to attend hearings or meetings. Her role in those matters had ended. The system now carried the responsibility forward. Clara Hayes disappeared from public attention. Her name no longer appeared in headlines. Social commentary moved on. Whatever consequences she faced unfolded away from cameras and public debate. Her absence was not dramatic. It was quiet, final, and unremarkable. Marcus Whitmore faced the consequences of his decisions. His sentence was carried out without public spectacle. His former life, defined by influence and control, was replaced by routine and restriction. The choices he had made followed him there. There were no appeals to sympathy. There was no redemption narrative offered. He paid the cost of what he had done. Lena did not dwell on him. She did not seek closure through confrontation or reflection on his downfall. His fate no longer intersected with her future. What mattered was what she was building now, not what had been lost. Custody and parental rights were fully secured. Legal orders ensured that Lena retained sole authority over her child's upbringing. There were no disputes, no conditions, and no lingering uncertainty. The decision was clear and protected by law. For Lena, this certainty was grounding. It allowed her to plan without fear of disruption. She began to see herself differently. For a long time, she had been defined by what happened to her. Now, that definition no longer fit. She was not a victim enduring circumstances. She was a mother shaping a life. The shift was subtle but profound. It changed how she spoke, how she moved, and how she envisioned the future. Silence took on new meaning. The absence of noise, argument, and fear was no longer unsettling. It was empowering. Silence became space to think, to heal, and to grow. It no longer signaled abandonment. It signaled peace. Justice did not arrive with celebration. There were no dramatic announcements or public declarations. It arrived quietly, through procedure and consequence. It did not erase the past, but it gave the past boundaries. It allowed the future to exist without being overshadowed. A sense of family reformed. Robert remained involved, not as a rescuer, but as a constant presence. The home they shared was calm. Conversations were practical and forward-looking. There was laughter, cautious at first, then more natural as time passed. The environment reflected stability rather than recovery. The story reached its conclusion without spectacle. There was no final confrontation, no need for words to be spoken aloud. The resolution existed in actions and outcomes rather than statements. Life continued, not because everything had been fixed, but because enough had been restored. Lena held her child and understood the meaning of survival. Not survival as endurance, but survival as transformation. She had moved through fear, loss, and abandonment and arrived somewhere new. The future was not guaranteed, but it was hers. The chapter closed fully. What remained was life, steady and unremarkable in the best way. A family protected, a mother secure, a child beginning their story without the weight of the past. The end was not loud. It was hopeful,